I want you to sit back and just imagine a scenario for a second. Let's pretend there's this massive global tech company. Maybe it's Apple, maybe it's Microsoft, or, some new behemoth.
Right, some absolute giant in the space.
Exactly. And they are gearing up for the biggest product launch of the decade. They're deploying an entirely new operating system overnight to hundreds of millions of users.
A massive rollout.
Huge.
Yeah.
And it's not just a cosmetic update, right? This code is going to integrate into every single facet of life. It's going to manage pacemakers in hospitals, sequence the traffic lights in major cities, route transactions for the global banking sector.
And probably handle all your personal communications, too.
Yeah, exactly. So the launch data set, the marketing blitz is everywhere, the CEO's on stage hyping up the features. But behind the scenes, there is this horrifying reality.
Which is what?
The engineers who wrote this monumental code base never actually ran it through a testing environment.
Wow, so they just wrote the code on a whiteboard and scheduled the release?
Pure deployment. No quality assurance department. No isolated sandbox to see if the modules conflict. No penetration testing for security flaws. Nothing.
That's just a recipe for disaster.
Right. Or, to make the hypothetical even darker, let's say a few mid-level engineers actually did spot a fatal flaw. They found a memory leak in the core architecture that guarantees the entire system will crash and burn within 3 years.
Okay, so they know it's broken.
Yeah. They bring this to the executive team, and the executives look at the marketing calendar, they look at the promised quarterly earnings, and they just decide to ship it anyway. They figure they'll push a patch later when things start breaking.
The fallout in the private sector would be apocalyptic. The moment that code hits the real world and the banking portals freeze or the traffic grids lock up, their stock would just evaporate.
Oh, instantly.
You'd have congressional hearings, massive class action lawsuits. The executive board would be facing criminal negligence charges. A tech company operating with that level of reckless disregard for structural integrity just wouldn't survive the week.
It really sounds like a dystopian corporate thriller. The idea of launching untested, structurally flawed code to millions of people is universally recognized as insanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, and this is the core of our deep dive today, when you step out of the software world and look at how human societies are governed, that exact terrifying scenario is basically the daily standard operating procedure.
It really is.
When global governments pass massive, sweeping legislation, they are essentially deploying an operating system onto society. And they almost never test the code.
We really have this massive collective blind spot when it comes to the nature of lawmaking. We sort of treat the passage of a law as a political finish line.
Right. The minister holds a press conference, the parliament claps, the media analyzes the partisan victory.
Exactly. But we forget that a law is not just a statement of values. It is an active incentive structure. It is a mechanism. You are deploying a set of rules into a complex, breathing ecosystem of highly rational actors.
You mean businesses, citizens, regional governments?
Yeah. And the state expects them to simply follow the path they drew on paper.
And when they don't follow that path, when the mechanism inevitably breaks down, we rarely blame the initial code. That's why we're looking at this incredible source material today. It's a theoretical institutional framework proposed by Elias Kunis.
It's a really fascinating blueprint.
It really is. He advocates for something called a mechanism authority. You can think of it as a taxpayer-funded red team for legislation. An elite, highly specialized agency whose sole purpose is to mathematically and behaviorally stress test society's operating code before it ever goes live.
And the foundational thesis of this framework is deeply unsettling, honestly, but is really hard to argue with once you see it.
How so?
Well, it posits that governance without an explicit, measured purpose will always optimize for whoever manages to capture it. We spend so much time debating the moral character of our politicians. We want virtuous people in charge.
Sure, we care a lot about who is sitting in the big chair.
Right, but this framework argues that character essentially dissolves in bad incentives. You can put a cabinet of living saints in charge of a broken mechanism, and the mechanism will dictate the outcome every single time.
If you're listening to this on your commute or, while you're working, you interact with these broken mechanisms constantly. You might just call it bureaucratic incompetence or a broken system.
We all feel it.
Yeah. It's that moment you realize a tax bracket rule makes taking a few extra gig economy shifts financially ruinous because you suddenly lose your housing assistance?
Or looking at a national healthcare system that somehow financially rewards hospitals for keeping patients on waiting lists rather than resolving their care quickly.
Exactly. We tend to throw our hands up and blame human nature or greed. But this deep dive is going to strip away the politics and explain the cold, hard math of why those things happen and how this blueprint proposes a radical fix.
To really understand the necessity of a mechanism authority, we have to isolate the specific missing function in modern democracies. We need to look at how a law actually travels from an idea to a reality.
Let's trace that life cycle. So a crisis happens or a campaign promise is made and a law is born. How does the system process that today?
The chronological flow usually starts at the political level with a macro goal. Let's use a very basic physical environment analogy.
Okay, I love analogies.
A parliament looks at the country and decides, well, the room is too cold. Our policy objective is to get the temperature to 21 degrees Celsius. That is the political mandate.
So they pass that goal down to the civil service, the ministries.
Right. The civil servants draft a legal document, a process mandate, which dictates the action. The action is turn on the central heater.
That seems like a highly functional chain of command. The elected officials set the destination, 21 degrees, and the bureaucrats execute the method, turning on the heater.
But the breakdown happens immediately after execution. The political system optimizes entirely for the act of turning the dial. The minister gets on television and proudly announces, "We have turned on the heater."
And the opposition argues about whether the heater should be gas or electric, probably.
Exactly. But the vital feedback loop is completely absent. Nobody is mandated to stand in the middle of the room with a thermometer to measure if the temperature actually reached 21 degrees.
Oh, I see.
Nobody checks if the heating element is broken. And crucially, nobody evaluates whether someone left all the windows wide open, meaning the heater is just burning expensive energy to warm the outside air.
So the press conference happens, the political points are scored, and the legislature just moves on to the next crisis while the people in the room are still freezing.
That's the reality of it.
But I know anyone working in government or following public policy is going to shout at their speakers right now. They're going to say, wait, we have oversight? Governments are famous for audits, inspectors general, impact assessment boards. There are entire alphabet soup agencies dedicated to checking the work of the state.
And to be fair, those agencies do essential work, but they are structurally incapable of catching mechanism flaws. If you map out the existing oversight ecosystem, it fractures into 3 distinct categories.
Okay, let's break those down.
And all 3 miss the core incentive design. First, you have the financial auditors. In the US, it's the GAO. In the UK, the NAO. These are incredibly rigorous accountants.
But they operate purely retroactively.
Exactly. They audit the expenditure after the reality has occurred. They are essentially performing forensic accounting on the ashes.
So they come into the freezing room a year later, look at the utility bills and say, yes, we can confirm the government legally procured a heater and the electricity bill was paid according to procurement guidelines.
Right. They verify the process of the spending, not the efficacy of the mechanism itself.
And that makes sense. What's the second category?
The second category is the process evaluators. These are internal ministry checkers who look at the administrative workflow. They ask questions like, did the drafting committee hold the legally required number of stakeholder hearings?
Did they fill out the right forms?
Did they write a 200-page comprehensive strategy document before turning on the heater? They are essentially grading the neatness of the handwriting on the exam, completely blind to whether the mathematical answers are actually correct.
So if the strategy document is formatted correctly,
Yeah.
it passes, even if the strategy itself is completely detached from reality.
Exactly. Which brings us to the third category, the one that theoretically should be doing this work, regulatory impact assessment boards.
Okay, almost every modern democracy has some version of this, right? They're advisory councils tasked with reviewing draft legislation to predict its impact.
Right.
But wait, that sounds exactly like a mechanism authority, so what's the problem?
The problem is one of structural power and, frankly, ridiculous resource starvation. These boards are chronically, often purposefully underfunded.
Purposefully underfunded.
Look at the scale of a modern nation-state. You have ministries pumping out hundreds of complex laws a year, laws that reshape energy grids, healthcare markets, tax codes.
Massive systemic changes.
And the source material highlights regulatory review boards operating on budgets of perhaps a few $100,000 a year, staffed by maybe 2 or 3 full-time analysts.
Oh, wow. You cannot seriously expect 3 people in a basement office to mathematically model the systemic impact of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare overhaul.
They are essentially a speed bump. They are a compliance box to be checked. Because they are purely advisory, when they do manage to spot a glaring mechanism flaw, they issue a warning that is routinely ignored.
Just brushed aside.
Yeah, the source framework points to instances where these tiny councils correctly predicted massive incentive failures in major reforms. But because the warning was politically inconvenient to a minister trying to pass a flagship law, the government simply bypassed the board.
They passed the law anyway.
They passed it, and the exact failure materialized years later.
So the internal capacity for rigorous proactive mechanism design is virtually non-existent.
Yeah.
But the laws are still incredibly dense. Someone is writing these 800-page bills. Someone is building the economic models used to justify them. If it's not the civil service, who is holding the pen?
Well, nature abhors a vacuum. And in modern governance, that vacuum of analytical capacity has been filled by what the sources term the shadow government.
A shadow government. That sounds sinister.
It's really just the management consulting industry. The state outsources the core intellectual work of mechanism design to global consulting firms, the McKinseys, the Boston Consulting Groups, the Deloittes of the world.
Ah, the era of PowerPoint governance. The state pays exorbitant daily rates to bring in consultants in sharp suits to figure out how to restructure the public sector.
And the reliance on these firms creates a toxic triad of systemic risk.
Okay, a toxic triad. Walk me through it.
The first risk is opacity. These firms use proprietary black box economic models. When a parliament votes on a massive reform, the elected representatives cannot actually look under the hood of the mathematics driving the law.
Because the consultancy claims the model is a protected trade secret?
Exactly.
That is wild. The code that will govern the citizens is hidden behind a corporate non-disclosure agreement.
The second risk is structural sycophancy. A consultancy's primary directive is to secure the next contract. They have a massive financial incentive to deliver a model that tells the incumbent politicians exactly what they want to hear.
So if a minister stakes their career on a privatization scheme that they claim will save 20% in costs,
the consultants will inevitably find a way to make their proprietary spreadsheet show a 20% saving.
the math is tortured until it confesses to the minister's political goals.
Beautifully put.
And I assume the third risk is what happens when that tortured math hits the real world.
Total lack of accountability. When the mechanism is deployed and the incentives inevitably fail, when the healthcare queues explode or the tax revenue plummets, the consultants are long gone.
They already collected their millions in fees upon the delivery of the PowerPoint deck.
Right. They bear zero legal or financial responsibility for the operational failure of the system 3 years down the line. The career civil servants are left to manage the crisis, the taxpayers foot the bill, and the consultancy is off advising another ministry.
Let's address the obvious counterargument here. Why do we need a specialized proactive agency? Why can't we just mandate that the existing auditors do their retroactive checks much faster? If a law passes and it's bad, just measure it quickly and repeal it.
Because that ignores the basic psychology of political power. By the time a law is drafted, debated, and passed, immense political capital has been locked into its existence.
A government has likely campaigned on this specific mechanism.
Exactly. The Prime Minister has staked their legacy on it. If an auditor comes along 18 months later and proves the mechanism is mathematically failing, reversing that law requires the ruling party to publicly admit a catastrophic, expensive failure.
It's the sunk cost fallacy, amplified by partisanship. Reversing course is viewed as political suicide, so instead of fixing the broken code, they double down.
They blame the civil servants for poor implementation, they blame the opposition for obstructing it.
Or they just pump more taxpayer money into the breaking machine, hoping it will eventually work. The ego of the state attaches to the mechanism the moment it passes. You have to catch the flaw before the ego gets involved.
That is exactly the reason proactive design is non-negotiable. But to truly understand what a proactive mechanism authority would look for, we have to look at the blind spot in the state's data architecture. The framework introduces a vital concept. It's called the missing meso level.
Okay, the missing meso level. Governments are data hoarders. They measure everything from inflation down to individual calorie consumption. What are they missing?
They are missing the connective tissue. The state has incredible visibility at the macro level. Central banks and finance ministries have highly sophisticated macroeconomic models. They can track gross domestic product, broad demographic shifts, aggregate inflation.
So the view from 30,000 feet.
Right, then drop down to the ground floor. The state is highly competent at the micro level, too. They have vast databases of individual registry data.
They know exactly how much income tax you paid last year.
They have health registry statistics on specific disease prevalence. They track individual property ownership. They have the macro and they have the micro.
So what is the meso level?
The middle layer, the layer of strategic interaction. The state models policy changes statically, assuming that if you drop a new rule onto the populace, everyone will continue behaving exactly as they did yesterday, just under the new rule.
They don't account for people reacting.
No. They fail to model how highly rational actors, corporations, local governments, individual citizens will dynamically alter their behavior to optimize their outcomes against the new incentive structure.
Let me pause you there because I want to bring in a famous concept, Goodhart's law. It states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. People are incredibly creative.
Very creative.
If you tax windows, people will brick up their windows. If you reward call center employees for the number of calls they handle, they will just hang up on customers after 10 seconds.
Right, they game the metric.
So isn't human behavior inherently unpredictable? If people will always find a way to game the system, aren't politicians basically just doing their best in an impossible situation?
That is the most common defense of bad policy, and it fundamentally misunderstands mechanism design. We are not asking the state to be clairvoyant. We don't need perfect prediction of the human soul.
So what do we need?
Goodhart's law is actually a tool of mechanism design, not a defense against it. If we know that actors will relentlessly optimize to game a metric, the solution is not to throw our hands up and pass the law anyway. The solution is to not design a mechanism that relies on a highly gameable metric remaining untouched.
We need to make this concrete for the listener. I want to walk through a highly specific, visceral example of a mechanism failure. The kind of failure that a mechanism authority would spot on day one, but that currently slips through the cracks. The blueprint talks about the soft budget constraint.
The soft budget constraint is perhaps the most destructive, invisible force in modern public administration. Let's build a scenario.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine a federal government wants to reform healthcare. They decide the federal bureaucracy is too slow, so they decentralize. They create 50 new regional healthcare authorities. Let's look at one specific region. We'll call it Valley County. The federal government gives the director of Valley County a mandate. You are now responsible for running the hospitals in your region. We will give you a block grant of $1 billion a year to do it.
On paper, this sounds like great policy. Local control, targeted funding. Valley County knows what Valley County needs.
But the mechanism has a fatal flaw in its architecture. Valley County is given the responsibility to spend money, but they are not given the constitutional power to collect taxes. Furthermore, the federal government has a legal and moral obligation to provide health care to its citizens. Everyone involved, the federal ministers, the local director, the hospital staff, knows that the federal government can never actually allow a regional hospital to go bankrupt and close its doors.
The political optics of padlocking an emergency room are impossible. No politician survives that.
Exactly. So put yourself in the shoes of the director of Valley County Healthcare. You are a rational actor. You are looking at your billion-dollar budget. If you run your hospitals with ruthless efficiency, if you make unpopular decisions to consolidate redundant clinics, and you come in under budget, what happens?
The federal government looks at your surplus and says, great, you clearly only need $900 million next year. You are penalized for efficiency.
Right. You take all the local political heat for closing a clinic, and your reward is a budget cut from the capital.
That's a terrible incentive.
Now look at the alternative. You hire aggressively, you build a massive new administrative wing, you give generous contracts to local suppliers, you blow through your billion-dollar budget by October. What happens?
You declare a financial crisis.
You point to the Constitution. The federal government, terrified of hospitals shutting down, is forced to pass an emergency supplemental bailout to cover your deficit.
The soft budget constraint. The constraint on spending isn't hard. It's an illusion.
If you are the regional director, the mathematically optimal career-maximizing move is to spend as recklessly as possible and force the central state to absorb the consequences. And this isn't a theoretical model. When governments implement these structures, the national healthcare costs inevitably explode, often doubling in a few years.
And when it explodes, the federal politicians go on television and blast the regional directors for being greedy and incompetent. They act shocked by the outcome.
But a mechanism authority looks at that draft legislation before it passes and flags it immediately. They don't need behavioral psychology to predict the outcome. They just need basic game theory.
They just look at the math.
They tell the parliament, if you divorce the political benefit of spending from the political pain of taxation, and you underwrite it with an implicit bailout guarantee, you have mathematically engineered infinite cost expansion. The code is broken. Do not deploy it.
That brings us to the core of this blueprint. We know the current system is driving blind, relying on consultants who face zero consequences and ignoring the basic physics of incentives. So how does this red team actually operate? Let's dive into the architecture of the Mechanism Authority. First of all, what is their actual mandate?
The Mechanism Authority is a centralized, elite hub for applied mechanism design. But it operates under a strict boundary condition. It does not choose societal values. It has no opinion on the moral direction of the state.
Let me test that. Let's say a newly elected government runs on a platform of aggressively transitioning to green energy. They want to eliminate fossil fuels in 10 years. Does the authority weigh in on whether that's a good idea?
Not at all. The parliament is sovereign over the destination. If the voters want rapid decarbonization, the authority accepts that as the fixed objective function.
Okay, so they don't fight the goal.
Never. The authority's only role is to evaluate the vehicle the parliament proposes to get to that destination.
Give me an example.
If the government drafts a complex carbon credit trading scheme to achieve that green transition, the authority analyzes the scheme and might say, your goal is decarbonization. But the specific loopholes in this trading mechanism will actually incentivize companies to shift production offshore and import the finished goods,
resulting in a net zero reduction in global emissions and a massive loss in domestic manufacturing.
Exactly. They don't judge the what, they ruthlessly evaluate the how.
And they don't just wait for Parliament to hand them a draft law either. One of the most fascinating concepts in this framework is the mechanism opening.
The mechanism opening is a proactive investigative power. Currently, oversight bodies only look at what they're asked to look at.
Right.
The authority has the mandate to scan the entire horizon of society, identify a standing systemic failure, and formally open an investigation into the underlying mechanism, even if no politician is currently talking about it.
It's the power to force legibility onto a problem. If the state is ignoring a rotting foundation because it's too complex to fix, the authority can drag it right into the public square.
And the framework categorizes these systemic failures into 5 distinct typologies. These are the specific bugs in the societal operating system that the authority is hunting for.
I want to walk through these 5 categories because this is where the abstract math maps directly onto the lived experience of the listener. Let's look at the first one, ownerless cross-ministry failures.
This is the catastrophic result of bureaucratic silos. Let's take the classic example of a single parent trying to improve their economic situation.
Okay.
The Ministry of Finance controls the income tax brackets. The Ministry of Housing controls rent subsidies. The Ministry of Social Affairs controls childcare benefits. Each individual ministry has optimized its own specific policy in a vacuum.
So the housing subsidy tapers off logically from their perspective. The tax bracket scales logically.
Right. But the single parent doesn't live in one ministry's jurisdiction. They live at the intersection of all of them. Let's say this parent is offered a promotion that requires 10 more hours of work a week.
That should be good news.
They do the math. The slight increase in gross salary pushes them into a new tax bracket. Simultaneously, crossing that income threshold triggers a sudden, steep drop in their housing subsidy. And because they're working 10 more hours, their state-subsidized daycare fees dynamically adjust upwards.
The infamous welfare cliff.
When you combine the intersecting mechanisms, the parent realizes that working 10 extra hours a week actually results in a net negative income. They are financially penalized for advancing.
This is a mechanism failure that destroys human potential.
But because the failure exists in the negative space between the ministries, nobody claims ownership of the problem. Finance says their taxes are fine. Housing says their subsidies are fine. The Mechanism Authority maps the holistic incentive landscape across all silos and points out the mathematical trap.
They act as the systems integrator. Okay, let's look at the second typology. Diffuse loser, concentrated winner failures. This sounds like the academic definition of crony capitalism.
It is the mathematical anatomy of rent-seeking. This occurs when a mechanism is designed to funnel a massive, highly visible financial windfall to a tiny, intensely organized group, perhaps a legacy telecom monopoly or a protected agricultural sector.
But the cost of generating that windfall is diluted across millions of individual consumers or taxpayers.
Right. A classic example would be a tariff on imported sugar. The domestic sugar cartels make hundreds of millions of dollars in guaranteed profits, but for the average citizen, the cost of that tariff is maybe $3 extra a year on their grocery bill.
And because $3 isn't enough to motivate a citizen to take a day off work, march on the Capitol, and lobby their representative, the diffuse losers remain silent.
But the concentrated winners will spend millions on lobbyists to ensure the mechanism stays in place. It is a highly stable, parasitic equilibrium.
So what does the authority do about it?
The authority's job is to aggregate that diffuse loss and present the true macroeconomic cost of the mechanism to the legislature.
Moving to the third category, and this one feels incredibly relevant today. Future person failures. How can an agency analyze a mechanism for someone who doesn't exist yet?
This deals with the temporal mismatch between political incentives and physical reality. The political cycle is incredibly short, right? An election every 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, they're always thinking about the next vote.
So the rational play for a politician seeking re-election is to maximize immediate, visible benefits for current voters and push the invisible costs as far into the future as possible.
Hand out tax cuts and new benefits today and fund it by issuing 30-year bonds or simply ignoring the maintenance of the electrical grid.
The people who will eventually have to pay those bonds or deal with the rolling blackouts when the grid collapses are not sitting at the negotiating table because they haven't been born yet or they're too young to vote.
That's a grim way to look at it, but it's true.
A future person failure is a mechanism that systematically cannibalizes the future to subsidize the present. The mechanism authority acts as the institutional mathematical advocate for the future balance sheet.
They force the current parliament to look at the 50-year demographic trajectory and acknowledge that a pension mechanism is mathematically guaranteed to bankrupt the next generation.
They bring the ghost of Christmas future right into the committee room.
I love that. The fourth category is hidden adjustment failures. This feels like the most cynical form of lawmaking.
It really is. It happens when the state imposes an impossible mandate without changing the underlying resource constraints. Imagine a law that guarantees every citizen the right to a specialist medical consultation within 7 days of a referral.
The politicians pass the law, they celebrate the victory for public health.
But they don't double the number of doctors and they don't double the budget.
You can't legislate doctors into existence. So what happens? The system has to absorb that pressure somehow.
It absorbs it through hidden, agonizing adjustments. If a doctor is legally mandated to see twice as many patients, the length of the consultation drops from 20 minutes to 8 minutes. The quality of care plummets.
And the criteria for getting a referral in the first place are quietly tightened by desperate administrators.
Exactly. The frontline staff burn out and quit, exacerbating the shortage. The political mechanism claims success on paper, while the physical system degrades silently in the shadows. The authority is designed to expose the lie of the hidden adjustment.
And the final category is missing architecture failures.
This is a macro-level void. It's when an entire vital sector of the state, perhaps digital infrastructure security or the transition of legacy industrial towns, is simply drifting.
There's no coherent mechanism guiding it.
Just a patchwork of reactive, contradictory legacy rules. The authority identifies these blank spaces on the map where proactive incentive design is desperately needed.
So the authority uses these 5 categories to hunt for problems. But once they isolate a specific piece of legislation, how do they dissect it? The framework outlines an analysis protocol with 4 specific checks. The first is balance sheet theft.
This is the audit of invisible consumption. A law might look economically neutral on paper, but it is actually consuming a vital capital stock that isn't measured in standard budgets.
Like what?
Well, are we achieving economic growth by permanently depleting a natural aquifer? Are we saving money in the education budget by pushing massive, uncompensated administrative burdens onto teachers, depleting our human capital?
Balance sheet theft forces every consumed resource onto the ledger.
Right.
The second check is a bit of academic jargon, revelation principle bias. If I'm a lawmaker, how do I fail the revelation principle?
You fail it by designing a system that relies on the honor system in a high-stakes environment. It is a fundamental concept in game theory.
Okay, break that down for me.
A poorly designed mechanism assumes that an actor will voluntarily reveal the truth about their situation, even when they have a massive financial incentive to lie or obscure the truth.
Like asking a multinational corporation to voluntarily calculate its own global tax liability without any enforcement mechanism and just trusting the number they submit.
Or designing a disability benefit system where the primary evidence is a self-reported survey. A robust mechanism, according to the revelation principle, is incentive compatible.
Incentive compatible. What does that mean in practice?
It is designed so that the most profitable, optimal strategy for the actor is to simply tell the truth. If your law requires angels to operate it, the authority flags it as a failure.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
The third check is implementation complexity traps.
This is where elegant academic theory collides with grim administrative reality. You can hire the smartest economists to design a hyper-targeted, dynamically adjusting subsidy for small businesses. It might be mathematically flawless. But if a small business owner has to spend 40 hours navigating a labyrinthine digital portal, and the frontline civil servants processing the claims need advanced degrees to understand the criteria, the mechanism will collapse under its own friction.
The people who need the help the most are usually the ones with the least amount of time and resources to navigate a complex bureaucracy. If the form is too hard, the mechanism fails.
Exactly. The authority evaluates whether the cognitive and administrative load of the mechanism matches the actual capacity of the people forced to use it.
And the final check is market illusion.
This is a favorite trick of the shadow government consultants. The state decides to outsource a public service, let's say the maintenance of the national rail network.
Okay, privatization.
They design an intricate auction mechanism relying on the magic of free market competition to drive down the price. But the mechanism authority looks at the actual physical landscape and says, there is no free market here.
Why not?
Because the specialized equipment required to maintain these rails is owned by exactly two massive conglomerates, and they have an implicit duopoly.
You've built an auction for a market that doesn't exist.
Designing a competitive bidding process for a functional monopoly is a market illusion. The state thinks it's being savvy, but it's actually just walking into a trap where it will be relentlessly squeezed for higher margins.
Looking at this entire architecture, the hunting for typologies, the rigorous checking of the math, it sounds incredibly similar to a cybersecurity red team.
It's a very apt comparison.
Their entire job is to hack their own company's servers to find the slow-day vulnerabilities before the real attackers do. But I have to ask, if the mechanism authority is just a group of hyper-intelligent people whose only job is to point out why the government's ideas are terrible, aren't they just going to become the most hated obstructive department in the state?
It's a huge risk, yeah.
Are they just professional complainers?
If they only pointed out flaws, they would be marginalized immediately. The genius of the blueprint is that the authority is mandated to be constructive. They maintain something called the Mechanism Library.
What's that?
This is a continuously updated, globally sourced database of proven, mathematically robust mechanisms.
So they don't just say, this bridge will collapse. They say, this bridge will collapse, but here are 3 alternative blueprints for bridges that can hold the weight.
Precisely. If a ministry drafts a flawed mechanism for, say, a carbon tax, the authority runs the red team analysis and exposes the flaws. But then they open the library.
They give them options.
They present the minister with alternative mechanisms. Option A uses a dividend model, which solves a regressive impact on low-income families. Option B uses a border adjustment tariff, which solves the problem of offshore manufacturing flight. Here are the mathematical models for both. We recommend option B.
They act as an elite design partner, transforming a negative critique into an actionable policy upgrade.
That's the only way they maintain political capital.
That transition from critique to design is crucial, but it leads us directly into a massive logistical hurdle. We're talking about building an elite strike team that can deconstruct constitutional law, model macroeconomic feedback loops, understand behavioral psychology, and write code.
It's a tall order.
Who on earth actually possesses this combination of skills, and how do you hire them?
The talent profile is a defining constraint of the entire framework. You are looking for a polymath. They need the legal precision of a Supreme Court clerk to read the draft legislation.
They need the quantitative chops of a high-frequency trading algorithm designer to map the game theory.
And they need the communication skills of a top-tier journalist to translate that complex math into a report that a layperson politician can actually understand and debate.
You aren't going to find that person by posting a listing on a standard civil service job board. Where does this talent currently live?
Over the last 20 years, the field of applied mechanism design has exploded, but the talent has been almost entirely absorbed by the private sector, specifically the tech monopolies and the financial sector.
Think about the internal mechanisms of big tech.
Amazon alone employs hundreds of PhD economists whose entire job is to design the microscopic incentive mechanisms of their marketplace, optimizing pricing algorithms and logistics networks. Uber hired massive swabs of behavioral economists to design the surge pricing mechanisms that manipulate both driver supply and rider demand in real time.
The smartest minds of our generation are currently employed to optimize click-through rates and rideshare algorithms.
Beyond big tech, you have the Web3 and crypto space, where tokenomics is literally just applied mechanism design, creating digital economies from scratch.
You have quantitative hedge funds like Citadel hiring theoretical physicists and game theorists to find arbitrage opportunities.
And you have elite auction consultancies that governments themselves hire to design the sale of 5G spectrums. The private sector understands that mechanism design is the ultimate lever for wealth generation. The public sector has completely lost the talent war.
So if the talent is this rare and this expensive, the mechanism authority can't be a sprawling bureaucracy. You can't hire 500 of these people.
And you wouldn't want to, even if you could. The framework imposes a strict cap on the size of the authority. The core team must be restricted to somewhere between 15 and 25 elite experts.
This isn't just a budgetary constraint, right? It is a mathematical imperative driven by the nature of complex systems analysis.
Right.
I want to dig into this because our instinct is always that a bigger team can do more work. If evaluating laws is hard, wouldn't 100 experts be better than 20?
Not when the task requires a holistic understanding of a massive interconnected system. When you are mapping how a change in agricultural subsidies cascades into trade policy, which cascades into environmental regulation, the analyst must constantly share highly complex mental models.
The math of human communication is brutal.
How does the math work?
Well, the number of communication channels in a group grows exponentially as you add members. The formula is n times n minus 1 divided by 2.
Okay, so with a tight elite team of 15 people, there are 105 distinct lines of communication.
They can all sit in a room, they understand each other's methodologies, the bandwidth of information flow is incredibly high.
Now double that team. Go from 15 to just 30 people. You don't double the communication channels, you quadruple them to 435.
So the coordination overhead starts to eat the actual analytical work.
Exactly. Add 100 people and you have thousands of channels. The team fragments into subcommittees. Knowledge gets siloed. The person analyzing the tax code no longer talks directly to the person analyzing the welfare state, and you recreate the exact same missing meso-level blind spot that the authority was created to fix.
Empirical data on elite skunkworks teams, for the Manhattan Project's core theoretical group to high-end software development, shows that for pure integrative cognitive work, anything over 25 people results in negative marginal returns.
It's an iron law of systems thinking.
But wait, a modern nation-state produces hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages of legislation a year. How can 20 people physically read, let alone rigorously stress test, the entire output of a government?
They can't. And this is where the framework integrates a highly specific division of labor between artificial intelligence and human experts.
Oh, so they bring in AI.
The authority does not use humans to read every line of a standard agricultural zoning update. They deploy massive, custom-trained large language models and automated parsing software to act as a dragnet.
So the AI reads the laws first. What is it looking for?
It's trained to hunt for structural risks. It scans the legislative text for threshold effects, like the welfare cliff we discussed earlier. It looks for circular logic in funding mandates. It flags bills that span multiple ministry jurisdictions.
The AI processes the sheer volume of the bureaucratic output and acts as a sophisticated triage system.
It produces a daily, prioritized list of high-risk, systemically important legislation.
It filters out the noise.
Yeah.
The AI flags the suspicious code, and then the humans step in.
Yes. The 20 elite human mechanism designers reserve their absolute cognitive bandwidth for the adversarial auditing of those flagged bills. Humans do what the AI cannot currently do.
Which is this?
They map the nuanced, localized behavioral responses, they synthesize the political context, and they design the creative alternative mechanisms from the library.
Okay, so we have a tiny team, augmented by AI. But we still have to actually recruit those 20 humans. How do you find a polymath without just relying on a traditional resume? If you require a PhD from Oxford, you might miss a brilliant systems thinker who dropped out of college to build a crypto protocol.
The blueprint actively discards traditional public sector recruitment. Standard civil servants hiring is obsessed with credentials, years served, and institutional affiliation.
Yeah, a lot of red tape.
The mechanism authority shifts entirely to capability-based recruitment. They use work sample testing.
Like how a software engineering interview forces you to write code on a whiteboard to prove you can actually do it.
Exactly. When you apply for the authority, you aren't asked about your background. You are handed a complex 50-page draft law that failed in another country 5 years ago. You are put in a room and told, deconstruct the incentive architecture, predict the behavioral equilibrium, and write a 2-page brief explaining the failure.
You either have the analytical horsepower or you don't.
That cuts through a lot of credential inflation.
They also utilize predictive tournaments, right? Heavily inspired by Philip Tetlock's research into super forecasters.
They track individuals over time to see who actually predicts macroeconomic or behavioral outcomes accurately, regardless of their academic pedigree.
And crucially, they rely on open methodology. Because the authority publishes all its models and data publicly, they allow anyone in the world to submit an analysis of a pending law.
If a 25-year-old unknown data scientist submits a brilliant mechanism critique via the public portal, the authority treats that as a recruitment signal.
But let me point out the massive multi-million-dollar reality check here. Public sector salaries, even at the highest executive levels, are capped. You might pay a director a couple $100,000.
At best, yeah.
A senior algorithm designer at Amazon or quant at Citadel is making millions of dollars a year in base salary and stock options.
Yeah.
Why on earth would a genius systems thinker walk away from a hedge fund to sit in a government office? You cannot win a bidding war against Citadel.
You can't win on pure financial compensation, so the authority doesn't try. They compete on the impact scale. They offer an intellectual and societal value proposition that no hedge fund or ad tech company can ever match.
Pitch me. I'm a quant at Citadel making $3 million a year. Why do I take a 90% pay cut?
Because right now, your brilliant mind is being used to shave microseconds off high-frequency trades to enrich a handful of billionaires. Or your intellect is being used to figure out how to make a teenager click on a targeted advertisement 4% more often.
Ouch.
The mechanism authority offers you the chance to literally design the operating system of a nation-state. You are offered the levers of history. You get to fix the structural poverty traps that ruin millions of lives. You get to design the carbon transition mechanisms that might save the ecosystem.
It's an appeal to legacy. Do you want to sell sugar water or do you want to change the world?
And the framework identifies a specific target demographic for this pitch, the diaspora. Every country has brilliant citizens who left because the domestic opportunities were too stifling.
They were working at the IMF, they're at the European Central Bank, they're in Silicon Valley.
They have proven their world-class capability, they've made their money, and they might be feeling a pull to return home to their families. But they refuse to return home just to get bogged down in a slow, low-impact domestic ministry.
The authority offers them a high-prestige, high-velocity landing pad. You bring the expatriate geniuses home.
That's the strategy.
Okay, let's assume the recruitment works. We have our strike team of 20 game theorists, the AI is humming, and they are churning out brilliant red team reports. This brings us to the ultimate friction point.
Politics.
Politicians are notoriously excellent at ignoring experts when the math is politically inconvenient. You can have the smartest people in the room handing the prime minister a report that says, this mechanism will crash the economy. But if the prime minister needs that law to pass to win an election next month, they will just throw the report in the shredder. How does the mechanism authority actually force politicians to read the manual?
This is where the framework shifts from theoretical design to hard institutional architecture. The authority is integrated into the legislative pipeline via a mandatory pre-legislative review and a 2-track override system.
How does the pre-legislative review work?
Before any significant bill can be presented to the full parliament for a vote, it must pass through the mechanism authority. The AI flags it, the humans audit it. If the authority finds that the core incentive structure is fundamentally flawed, if it fails the checks we discussed, they issue a formal red rating.
A red rating. Does that kill the bill? Does the unelected authority have a veto?
No, and that is constitutionally vital. They cannot veto.
Wow.
But a red rating triggers the first track, an internal procedural block within the executive branch. In most parliamentary systems, a bill has to be approved by the cabinet in a plenary session before it goes to the legislature.
Right, the cabinet has to sign off.
A red-rated bill is procedurally barred from entering that cabinet session. It is quietly sent back to the drafting ministry with a clear message. The code is broken. Use the mechanism library, fix it.
This happens behind closed doors, so the minister doesn't suffer public humiliation. They just have to do their homework over again. But what if the minister is an ideologue? What if the prime minister looks at the red rating and says, I don't care about the game theory. We promised this on the campaign trail, and we are ramming it through.
If the prime minister is determined to override the math, they can. The authority cannot veto the democratic will. But forcing the bill through triggers the second track, which is a mechanism of weaponized transparency.
Weaponized transparency. I love that. What happens?
If the executive bypasses the red rating, the authority's scathing, detailed mathematical assessment is legally mandated to be attached to the draft bill as a front-page annex.
Oh,
When the bill enters Parliament, the entire opposition, the media, and the public see exactly how it is predicted to fail. Furthermore, the responsible minister is legally required to stand up in front of the Parliament and deliver a formal public response, explicitly explaining why the government is choosing to ignore the mathematical reality of the mechanism authority.
that is an agonizing political position. The minister has to stand at the podium and say, yes, the elite experts have mathematically proven this will cost billions more than we claim, and yes, they have shown how it will fail, but we are doing it anyway for political reasons.
It raises the political cost of ignoring reality to near fatal levels. It strips away the most common defense politicians use when things go wrong, the defense of unforeseen consequences.
Because they can't say they didn't know.
When a bad law inevitably collapses 3 years later, the minister cannot claim they did their best with unpredictable circumstances. The opposition can hold up the authorities' annex and say, you were warned on exactly what day and in exactly what manner this would fail, and you overrode the warning.
It forces absolute accountability. Is there any precedent for this? Has any country actually successfully deployed this kind of forcing function on their politicians, or is this pure theory?
It is heavily based on proven models. The blueprint draws on several global peer institutions that have successfully altered political behavior. The most striking example is the Netherlands, and an institution known as the CPB, their Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis.
What does the CPB do that is so special?
Before every national election, the CPB executes a process called doorrekening, which essentially means calculating or costing out the promises. Every major political party takes their entire campaign platform, every promised tax cut, every promised new hospital, and submits it to the CPB.
Okay. And
The CPB runs all the platforms through a unified, rigorous economic model to calculate the dynamic effects and the true cost.
Wait, they audit the campaign promises before the citizens vote?
Yes. Imagine a debate stage where a populist candidate promises to slash income taxes by 20%, double the military budget, and balance the national deficit.
In most countries, the media just argues about it. Right?
Yeah. In the Netherlands, the CPB publishes a report saying, we ran the math. This platform will actually result in a 40 billion euro structural deficit and trigger massive inflation.
That completely destroys the culture of magical thinking. Politicians can't just invent numbers to win votes.
It forces an incredibly high baseline of honesty into the political culture. If a party refuses to submit their platform to the CPB, the electorate immediately assumes they are hiding a catastrophic lie and they are punished at the polls.
The Mechanism Authority scales that concept, from pre-election promises to daily lawmaking.
Exactly.
Are there other examples of this mindset taking hold globally?
Germany has the NKR, the National Regulatory Control Council. It's a tiny, highly independent secretariat that audits the compliance costs of federal laws, but their real superpower is enforcing the feedback loop.
How do they do that?
If a law is passed that generates over €1 million in costs, the NKR ensures there is a mandatory ex post evaluation 3 to 5 years later. They force the government to go back and check if the heater actually warmed the room.
And then you have Singapore. Singapore is famous for its hyper-efficient administration. How do they handle mechanism design?
In Singapore, they don't just rely on an external watchdog. They bake the capability into the DNA of the state. Game theory, complex system dynamics, and applied mechanism design are not obscure electives.
They are mandatory foundational training for the elite tiers of the civil service.
The entire upper echelon of the government natively speaks the language of incentives.
But the Mechanism Authority blueprint goes even further than these examples, doesn't it? They have something called automatic alerts.
Yes. The authority doesn't just review new laws, it monitors the ongoing health of the societal operating system. They maintain a public dashboard tracking critical systemic metrics, things like the severity of regional debt traps, the decay rate of critical energy infrastructure, or the specific drop-off rates at welfare cliffs.
Now, the authority sets mathematical thresholds for these metrics, and if a metric crosses into the red zone,
It triggers an automatic alert. This bypasses the discretion of the ministers entirely. A minister cannot simply sweep a worsening metric under the rug because it's an election year.
so what does the alert actually do?
The automatic alert forces a mandatory hearing in the relevant parliamentary committee. The legislature is legally forced to convene, look at the flashing red light on the dashboard, and publicly address the mechanism failure.
Okay, I have to step in here and play the ultimate devil's advocate. I can hear the political scientists and the critics screaming at their devices right now. The critique is one word: technocracy.
It's a valid concern.
Doesn't this entire architecture fundamentally undermine democracy? You are taking a tiny group of 20 unelected, highly paid math geniuses and giving them the power to block laws, trigger mandatory hearings, and publicly humiliate a democratically elected prime minister. Isn't handing the keys of the state to an elite algorithm fundamentally anti-democratic?
It is the most vital pushback, and it requires us to draw a razor-sharp distinction. The entire defense of the mechanism authority rests on separating two concepts: values versus mechanisms. Democracy is the absolute sovereign over value.
Meaning the voters decide what kind of society they want to live in.
Exactly. If the electorate votes for a government that promises high taxes and massive wealth redistribution, the authority cannot intervene and say, actually, low taxes and deregulation create higher aggregate GDP. That is a value judgment.
The authority is blind to the moral destination.
Right.
But practically speaking, if the authority issues a red rating on the government's flagship wealth tax bill because the mechanism is flawed, aren't they effectively blocking the democratic will?
Yeah.
The voters asked for a wealth tax, and the math nerds killed it.
They didn't kill the value, they exposed a broken vehicle. Let's trace that example. The voters want a wealth tax. The government drafts a mechanism. The authority models it and discovers that because of specific capital mobility loopholes in the draft, the tax will actually cause billions to flee offshore,
resulting in less revenue for redistribution than the current system.
The authority tells the parliament, your stated democratic goal is to increase revenue via a wealth tax. This specific mechanism will mathematically do the exact opposite. Here are 3 alternative wealth tax mechanisms from our library that will actually trap the capital and generate the revenue you want.
They aren't saying, don't build the bridge. They are saying, the bridge you drafted will collapse and kill the people you were trying to help. Use these steel girders instead of balsa wood.
They are protecting democracy from its own short-termism and its susceptibility to bad math. We already accept this principle in other areas.
Like where?
A democracy willingly constrains its future self to prevent catastrophic decisions. We grant independence to central banks so that a desperate prime minister cannot simply print $1 trillion right before an election to buy votes and trigger hyperinflation.
The mechanism authority is the exact same principle applied to structural law. It forces the political system to confront the physical reality of its choices. Okay, that brings it to the final piece of the puzzle. If this authority is going to wield this much soft power, if it can force ministers into awkward press conferences and expose the systemic failures of the state will inevitably fight back. The empire will strike back. Politicians will try to corrupt it, defund it, or capture it with their cronies.
Absolutely, they will try.
How is the authority protected from the very system it's trying to regulate? What is the defensive architecture?
The blueprint is highly paranoid about regulatory capture and political retaliation, and rightfully so. The first and most important line of defense is financial independence. The mechanism authority is not funded through the standard annual budget appropriation process voted on by Parliament.
Why is the annual budget a vulnerability?
Because the power of the purse is the ultimate silencer. Imagine the authority publishes a scathing red rating report on the Prime Minister's pet infrastructure project in October. If the authority's budget is up for a vote in November, the Prime Minister's party will quietly slash their funding by 50% in retaliation.
So how do you fund it without giving the politicians that leverage?
To eliminate this threat, the authority is funded by an initial massive capital endowment.
Like a university endowment or a sovereign wealth fund?
Exactly. The state makes a one-time capital injection, and the authority funds its operations purely from the yield of that endowment. The politicians literally cannot defund them year to year. The only way to take the money away is to pass a massive, highly visible structural law to seize the capital, which carries a massive political cost.
So the money is safe. What about the people? You mentioned these experts are paid top quartile private sector salaries to compete with big tech. Doesn't that make them massive targets for populist outrage? Look at these elite bureaucrats making millions while the working class struggles.
It does, which is why the compensation structure is meticulously designed to be highly lucrative but entirely devoid of what the framework calls discretionary perks.
What does that mean in practice?
It means they are paid a transparent, flat, very high salary. But there are zero hidden benefits. No taxpayer-funded corner offices with mahogany desks. No first-class flights to international conferences. No vague representation expenses for fancy dinners.
Why focus on the perks rather than the salary?
The source material references historical examples where the public trust in an oversight body was destroyed, not because the public disagreed with the high salary, but because a tabloid published a photo of the director expensing a luxury spa treatment or a first-class upgrade.
It's the optics of corruption. The public can tolerate paying an expert for their brain, but they despise paying for their vanity.
By stripping away every single perk, the authority remains ascetic in its operations. It removes the surface area for cheap tabloid scandals, protecting the institution's core legitimacy.
What about the revolving door problem? If these 20 experts are dissecting the mechanisms of massive global industries, telecoms, energy conglomerates, pharmaceuticals, isn't there a massive temptation to go soft on an industry so they can get a cushy lobbying job when their term ends?
The future employer constraint is the deadliest form of regulatory capture. If a regulator is constantly thinking about their next job, they will instinctively protect their potential future employers. The authority counters this with a mandatory draconian cooling-off period.
How draconian?
When an expert leaves the authority, they are legally prohibited from working for, advising, or lobbying for any entity or sector they evaluated for a full 24 months.
2 years is an eternity in the tech or finance world. Wouldn't that deter people from joining?
It would, which is why the cooling-off period is fully paid. The expert receives their full high-tier salary for those 2 years while they transition. It buys their absolute independence.
That's smart.
They can go write a book, transition into academia, or prepare for an international role without ever needing to curry favor with the domestic industries they are currently auditing.
That is a brilliant alignment of incentives. What about the leadership? Who actually runs this agency?
The framework mandates a strict outsider requirement for the Director General and the founding board. The leader cannot be a career domestic bureaucrat, a former local politician, or someone deeply embedded in the domestic lobbying scene. They must have significant international experience, years spent working outside the country.
Why? Why not hire someone who knows the local system perfectly?
Because you cannot objectively evaluate a system if you are a product of it. If the Director General went to the same elite university as the Prime Minister, and they attend the same dinner parties as the telecom CEOs, they are captured by the old boys network.
The leadership must be culturally fluent, but socially and professionally completely independent from the domestic power structures.
They need to be willing to burn bridges because they don't live on the island.
Okay, they are financially secure, they have no perks to be scandalized by, and they are immune to cronyism. But at the end of the day, they are still just 20 people doing math. How do we know their math isn't biased? How do we know the models they use are actually right?
The ultimate impenetrable defense is public methodology. The Mechanism Authority is not a black box like the shadow government consultants. Every single thing the authority does is entirely open source.
Out of every line of code.
Every economic model, every behavioral assumption, every data set they use to generate a red rating is published on a public repository. Any academic, any journalist, any rival economist at a think tank can download the model, check the math, and look for bias.
So if the authority says a tax cut will cost $1 billion, the ruling party can have their own economists look at the exact spreadsheet to try and prove the authority wrong.
Exactly. But it goes one step further. The authority maintains a public prediction calibration ledger. They keep a permanent, unalterable public score of their own accuracy.
Or the batting average.
If the authority predicts that a mechanism will result in a 10% increase in healthcare wait times, and 3 years later the wait times actually decrease, that failure is permanently logged. Their power is not derived from their title. It is derived entirely from their testable, publicly verifiable accuracy over time. They cannot hide their mistakes.
It's like building the agency in a massive glass box, suspended on a concrete pillar in the middle of the public square. It is completely transparent to everyone, but structurally impossible for the politicians to reach up and smash it. But let me ask you the ultimate bottom line question. Building this authority sounds incredibly difficult. It requires immense political will, it requires finding and hiring these rare polymath geniuses, and it requires fundamentally rewiring the constitution of how a nation makes laws. What happens if a country looks at this blueprint and just says, no thanks, it's too hard, we'll just keep muddling through with our current system of consultants and retroactive audits? What is the true cost of doing nothing?
The source material addresses this with a chilling, historically proven reality. Fix it yourself, or it gets fixed for you.
Oof. That sounds incredibly ominous.
It is the brutal reality of global economics. A nation-state is not immune to math. If a country refuses to proactively fix its broken mechanisms, if it allows the demographic debt to spiral into the future, if it ignores the ownerless cross-ministry traps that keep its citizens in poverty, if it continuously passes laws that mathematically fail, that country will eventually drift into structural crisis.
The debt will explode, the infrastructure will collapse, the currency will falter.
And when the internal capacity to govern fails, external forces arrive. When you lose control of your own mechanisms, the vacuum is filled by external powers, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, the global bond vigilantes.
And when these external forces step in to restructure your society, they do not optimize for the well-being, the culture, or the prosperity of your citizens.
They optimize for their own ruthless goals, ensuring creditors get paid, stabilizing the macrocurrency zone, and mitigating global risk. They will come in and slash the budgets, privatize the assets, and they won't care about the hidden adjustment failures.
They will force the bitter medicine down the throat of the state. We have seen this play out historically in Southern Europe during the sovereign debt crisis and repeatedly in emerging markets. Building a mechanism authority is not just an administrative upgrade, it is a fundamental defense mechanism for national sovereignty.
It is the capacity to identify and fix your own fatal flaws before they accumulate into a crisis that costs you your independence.
Let's pull all of this together. We started with a radical premise, treating the laws of a nation-state with the same rigorous paranoid testing that we applied to software code. We saw how the current system drives blind, optimizing for political press conferences while outsourcing the actual math to unaccountable consultants.
We explored the solution. A tiny, elite red team, heavily augmented by AI, dedicated to proactively hunting down the hidden mechanism failures, the welfare cliffs, the rent-seeking monopolies, the future debt bombs.
We looked at the sheer difficulty of hiring these people away from Wall Street and big tech, and the necessity of giving them the power to force politicians into the light, making them publicly own the consequences of bad math. And we saw the paranoid glass box architecture required to protect this team from the inevitable political backlash.
The ultimate takeaway is a shift in how we view the world. When a government policy fails spectacularly, it is almost never a failure of unpredictable human nature. It is almost always a predictable mathematical failure of mechanism design.
It is a bug in the code that could have been modeled, simulated, and fixed before it ever ruined a single life. And that brings us back to you listening to this deep dive. The next time you're trapped in a system that seems incredibly stupid, unnecessarily complex, or actively hostile, remember that it was designed.
It is not a law of physics, it's just bad code.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If we accept the premise that systems and mechanisms dictate human behavior far more than individual character, turn that lens on your own life. Look at the company you work for, the community organizations you belong to, or even the dynamic in your own household. What broken mechanisms are you currently trapped in? And if you were given the power of an elite mechanism designer, how would you rewrite the invisible rules of that system to change the outcome without ever trying to change the people?
It is an incredibly powerful analytical tool. Once you start seeing the underlying mechanisms, you will never look at human behavior the same way again.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time your phone updates overnight, just be glad somebody ran it through a testing environment first. We'll catch you next time.